Welcome, dear listener, to another peaceful voyage through the pages of history. As you settle into your warm bed or favorite armchair, let us embark on tonight's journey back to the age of chivalry, a time of gleaming armor, fluttering banners, and the relentless clash of steel. The medieval knight has long captured our imagination, conjuring visions of gallantry, valor, and courtly romance. Yet beneath this gilded facade lies a far darker truth, one of brutality, suffering, and endless warfare. Tonight, as you drift into slumber, we'll strip away the layers of myth to reveal the true essence of knighthood. This is no fairy tale of castles and heroes, but a raw tale of mud, blood, and the desperate struggle to survive in a merciless era. Picture, if you will, a medieval battlefield, a vast, churned wasteland of filth and gore, trampled beneath the hooves of war horses. The air hangs thick with the stench of sweat, smoke, and the sickening odor of death. A deafening cacophony assaults the senses, the shriek of steel on steel, the wet thud of arrows finding flesh, the agonized screams of the dying. This is the knight's world. But how did these warriors come to be? Let us begin at the beginning, with the origins and training of a medieval knight. In the turbulent centuries after Rome's fall, a new social order took shape across Europe. Feudalism birthed a class of elite mounted warriors, sworn to serve their lords in exchange for land and status. The path to knighthood was long and grueling, often starting in childhood. A noble boy, barely 7 years old, would be sent away as a page in a lord's household. There, he learned courtly manners and honed his skills in riding, hunting, and falconry. As he grew, the page became a squire, tasked with assisting his knight in battle and tournaments. He trained relentlessly with sword, lance, and mace, building strength through punishing drills. Yet a squire's education wasn't just physical, it was moral and spiritual. He was steeped in the code of chivalry, a complex ideal of bravery, honor, loyalty, and courtly love. To be a knight was to aspire to a higher calling, to stand as a beacon of Christian virtue in a world drowning in sin. Consider the tale of William Marshal, often hailed as the greatest knight of his age. Born into minor nobility, William was given as a hostage at 5 to ensure his father's loyalty to the English crown. When his father rebelled, the boy's life hung by a thread. Yet fate smiled. The king, struck by William's courage, spared him and sent him to Normandy for training. Marshal's rise was meteoric. As a squire, he dazzled in tournaments, earning a reputation for skill and daring. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine noticed him, propelling his career into the service of Plantagenet kings. But his true test came on the battlefield, a life of ceaseless war across France, Normandy, and the Holy Land. He embodied chivalry's ideal, a paragon of loyalty and valor, even as the horrors of combat swirled around him. And brutal they were. As feudalism matured, so too did the knight's arms and armor. By the 12th century, a knight was a fearsome figure, clad head to toe in mail and plate, astride a massive destrier bred for war. Each piece of his panoply was a masterpiece. The helm with its fluttering crest, the tunic of interlocking rings deflecting blows, gauntlets and greaves shielding limbs. A surcoat emblazoned with heraldic symbols let allies and foes alike recognize him in the chaos of battle. For in the maelstrom of medieval combat, distinguishing friend from foe was near impossible. A knight's weapons were instruments of death, honed to lethal perfection. The lance, iconic in justs, found its true purpose on the battlefield, striking with bone-shattering force. The sword, a symbol of status and a butcher's tool, could cleave through mail and flesh alike. Maces, warhammers, and axes crushed armor and bone, while daggers delivered the final mercy, or cruelty, to fallen foes. And then there was the destrier itself, a weapon in its own right. Towering and muscular, it wore armor too, the chamfron for its head, the crinnet for its neck, the patrol for its chest. Its hooves were deadly, capable of crushing a man or lashing out in the fray. Yet such gear came at a staggering cost. Outfitting a knight demanded wealth equal to a small manor. A warhorse could cost a merchant's yearly income. Maintaining a knight's retinue strained medieval society, a burden that would hasten feudalism's decline and the rise of professional armies. And what of the men beneath the armor? For all the talk of chivalry and honor, a knight's life was one of unrelenting hardship and peril. Battle was chaos incarnate, a swirling hell of horses and men, of mud and blood, and the stench of fear. Imagine the knight on the eve of combat, steeling himself for the horrors ahead. He might spend the night in prayer, confessing sins and making peace with God. At dawn, his squires would help him don his armor, a process taking hours. Then, with a final sip of wine and a priest's blessing, he'd mount his steed and take his place in the line of battle. The chaos defied description. Visibility was nil through his helm's narrow slits. The din was deafening, steel clashing, men roaring, the cries of the wounded and dying. Wounds were ghastly, shattered bones, severed limbs, deep gashes festering with infection. Medical care was primitive. Many knights died slowly from injuries that today would be trivial. For those who survived the initial clash, the aftermath was its own nightmare. The field was a charnel house of corpses and the writhing wounded. The stench of death clung to the air as scavengers, human and animal, picked over the dead. Capture was a fate worse than death. A prisoner might be ransomed back at ruinous cost, or, if unlucky, face slavery or execution. Many knights rotted in dungeons for years, enduring unspeakable torment. The psychological toll was immense. Knights witnessed friends butchered, or the guilt of survival, and faced the ever-present specter of their own mortality. Take Jean de Joinville, chronicler of King Louis IX of France, who recounted the aftermath of the Battle of Montserrat in 1250, where French forces were routed by Egyptian Mamluks. Sights of pain and woe met our eyes. The field of battle was strewn with corpses, and the river ran red with blood. Headless bodies and limbless trunks littered the ground, and the stench was so great that one could hardly endure it. This was the grim reality of knighthood, not the shining ideal of chivalry and honor, but a brutal, blood-soaked struggle for survival in a world drowning in violence. And yet, despite the horror and hardship, the allure of knighthood endured. Why? Part of the answer lies in the seductive power of myth and legend. The knights of romance and epic, the Arthurian heroes, the paladins of Charlemagne, bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts. They were paragons of virtue, models of grace and valor, untouched by the ugly truths of war and politics. These idealized figures served a vital purpose. They embodied the aspirations of a violent culture, offering a glimpse of nobility amid the chaos. But the chivalric code was always more dream than reality. For every knight who upheld its lofty principles, countless others betrayed them. Medieval history brims with tales of knights who were little more than glorified thugs, raping, pillaging, and murdering with impunity. Take Raoul de Cambrai, a 10th century French knight immortalized in epic poetry. In verse, he's a paragon of knightly virtue, a fierce warrior and loyal vassal. But history paints a far darker portrait. In 943, Raoul launched a brutal campaign against the town of Origny, sacking its monastery and setting fire to the church where townsfolk had sought refuge. Hundreds burned alive, including nuns trapped in the tower. When the abbot begged for mercy, Raoul beheaded him on the spot. This was the true face of knightly warfare, not flowery tales of chivalry, but a naked struggle for power and plunder where the strong preyed on the weak. The knight was a creature of his time, forged in violence and hardened by an unforgiving age. And yet, for all its brutality, the knightly ideal held a strange allure. It offered purpose and identity, a way to rise above the common herd. To be a knight was to join an elite brotherhood, bound by oaths of loyalty and the pursuit of glory. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes would later say, knighthood promised something higher, a dream worth fighting for, even if reality fell short. So the knight endured through centuries of war and upheaval, adapting as feudalism gave way to nation-states. He evolved into the cavalryman, the officer, the professional soldier. But the myth lived on, a potent symbol of a bygone era of romance and chivalry. In the modern imagination, the knight became a figure of nostalgia, a reminder of when men were brave and true, when honor still mattered. And so we reach the end of our tale. As you drift towards sleep, ponder the knight's complex legacy, a figure of myth and bloodshed, of savagery and grace, both a product of his time and timeless. He remains an enduring symbol of humanity's search for meaning in a world that often offers none. Rest well, and dream of knights and ladies, of castles and quests, of a world where virtue and honor still hold sway. For in the end, perhaps that is the knight's greatest gift, not the reality, but the dream of what we might yet become. The battlefield at Agincourt presented a horrific tableau as dawn broke over the blood-soaked mud. Exhausted English knights surveyed the carnage. Once proud French nobles now lay twisted in death, their resplendent armor ruptured and stained crimson. Piles of contorted bodies steamed in the chill October air while crows and camp followers picked through the wreckage. Veteran knight Sir Robert Babington wiped his brow with a trembling hand, smearing dried blood and grime across his weathered face. In his long years serving King Henry, he'd witnessed many battles, but never such wholesale slaughter. The flower of French chivalry had charged with arrogant recklessness, only to be mowed down by low-born English archers, men they despised as beneath them. Robert shuddered, recalling the meaty thunk of arrows piercing flesh, the screams of men and horses, the desperate press of bodies where blades rose and fell seeking gaps in armor. He'd been in the thick of it, watching young French knights, mere boys really, die terrified in the mud, their bowels loosening as life fled. The chivalry celebrated in songs had been conspicuously absent on this field. Yet even as he stood among the corpses, Robert knew few knights would trade their station. The promise of glory, riches, and renown, of having their deeds immortalized, drove them back to battle again and again. He was no different. From obscurity, he'd risen to become one of Henry's trusted knights, admired for his tournament prowess and battlefield feats. But on days like this, such a claim felt hollow. That dying boy's wide, terrified eyes would haunt him, as would the crunch of his sword through armor and bone. Later there would be prayers thanking God for victory, toasts to fallen foes as courtesy demanded. But the savage reality behind chivalry's gleaming facade would linger in his nightmares. Yet when next the king called his banners, Robert knew he'd strap on his sword without hesitation. This brutal existence was his calling, the only life he'd ever known. May God have mercy on his soul. The English army marching from Calais made a fearsome sight, ragged and mud-spattered from the long siege of Harfleur, yet buoyed by victory's promise. At their head rode King Henry himself, resplendent in gilded armor, his crowned helm shining. Not yet 30, his flinty gaze and set jaw spoke of iron will. He'd come to claim France's crown, and would brook no obstacle. Beside him rode Sir Thomas Erpingham, a grizzled veteran who'd served Henry's father and grandfather. His scarred face and battered armor testified to decades of warfare. As Marshal, it fell to him to maintain order on the march. Calling a halt at a rise, Erpingham dispatched scouts. The army waited tensely, only horses' snorts and creaking leather breaking the silence. When the scouts returned, they reported no French forces ahead. "I distrust this quiet," Erpingham growled. "The French are planning something, mark my words." Henry smiled wolfishly. "Let them come. We'll give them a welcome they won't forget." Raising a gauntlet fist, his blue eyes blazing, he cried, "God is with us." The men cheered, but Erpingham remained silent. He'd seen too much war to trust in divine favor. Piety wouldn't stop French lances. Henry turned to him, voice low and fierce. "I will have France's crown." "As you say, my liege," Erpingham bowed. "But never underestimate French knights." Henry's smile turned grim. "Then we'll give them battle on our terms, and smite them hip and thigh." As they rode on, Foreboding settled over Erpingham like a shroud. Henry's boldness epitomized knightly valor, but the old marshal feared it would lead them to disaster. The life of a medieval knight was forged in the crucible of relentless training and ceaseless warfare. From their earliest days as pages and squires, these warrior apprentices endured grueling regimens to prepare for the brutal realities of combat. They honed their skills with heavy weapons through endless repetition, spent countless hours mastering horsemanship, and steeled themselves for the chaos of the battlefield through punishing mock battles. One of the most celebrated knights of this era was William Marshal, whose journey from humble beginnings to legendary status exemplified the knightly ideal. Born in 1147 to a minor noble family, young William was sent to Normandy to train under William de Tancarville, a powerful baron and renowned juster. As a squire, Marshal excelled in the martial arts that would make his reputation, his prowess with lance and sword matched only by his extraordinary stamina and battlefield courage. In 1167, at just 20 years old, William was knighted on the battlefield by his lord and quickly established himself as a formidable warrior. But even for someone of Marshal's exceptional talents, medieval warfare remained a harsh and unforgiving endeavor. In this pre-gunpowder era, combat was intensely personal. Knights hacked and slashed at each other with heavy swords, maces, and battle axes at close quarters. The clang of steel on steel, the screams of the wounded and dying, the stench of blood and voided bowels. These were the sights, sounds, and smells that defined a knight's existence. The dangers didn't end when the fighting stopped. Captured knights often faced ransom demands that could bankrupt their families. Those who couldn't pay might be enslaved or executed. Disease stalked military camps, with dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses spreading rapidly in the close, unsanitary conditions. Yet despite these risks, knighthood's allure remained powerful. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on honor, courage, and loyalty, held tremendous appeal in a violent, chaotic world. Knights were celebrated in song and story, their deeds immortalized in both history and legend. Of course, reality often fell far short of this romantic ideal. While some knights genuinely strove to uphold chivalric principles, many others were motivated by baser instincts, greed, ambition, and bloodlust. In an era where might often made right, knights frequently committed acts of shocking brutality, particularly against those they considered beneath them. One notorious example was the French knight Raoul de Coucy, who earned a fearsome reputation for ruthlessness during the 100 Years' War. In 1373, de Coucy was sent to crush a peasant revolt in northern Italy. When the townspeople of Cesena refused to surrender, he ordered his men to storm the walls and put the inhabitants to the sword. What followed was a massacre of unimaginable brutality. Thousands of men, women, and children slaughtered in the streets. Contemporary accounts describe de Coucy taking sadistic pleasure in the carnage, personally executing hundreds and encouraging his men to commit acts of rape and mutilation. But even for knights like de Coucy who reveled in violence, the battlefield remained a terrifying and unpredictable place. In the heat of combat, even the most skilled warriors could fall to a stray arrow or a well-placed sword stroke. The limited visibility through a helmet's narrow eye slits, the deafening noise, the press of bodies, all made it easy to become disoriented or separated from comrades. Many knights met their ends anonymously in the muddy fields of France, Flanders, and other medieval battlegrounds, their armor dented and torn, their bodies broken and lifeless. For those who survived battle, the aftermath could be nearly as traumatic as the fighting itself. The sight of the dead and dying, the moans of the wounded, the stench of rotting flesh. These were the grim realities knights had to confront. Some turned to prayer or drink to cope. Others simply tried to bury the memories and move on to the next conflict. For many, the psychological toll of combat became a heavy burden they carried long after leaving the battlefield. The tournament circuit became William Marshal's proving ground, where the young knight's star rose meteorically through a combination of martial brilliance and shrewd opportunism. In one remarkable early tournament, the ambitious warrior reportedly captured an astonishing 500 knights along with their horses and armor, a windfall that allowed him to assemble his own formidable retinue. This early success set the pattern for Marshal's career, blending battlefield prowess with political acumen to ascend from landless knight to England's most powerful magnate. Yet Marshal was no mere brute. His true genius lay in balancing martial ferocity with diplomatic finesse. When caught between family loyalty and feudal oath during King Henry II conflict with rebel barons, including Marshal's own father, he made the agonizing choice to remain loyal to his king. After the rebels' defeat, when Henry ordered the execution of Marshal's father alongside other rebel leaders, the young knight fell to his knees in a dramatic plea for mercy. The king, moved by this display of both loyalty and filial piety, granted an unprecedented pardon. This defining moment revealed Marshal's mastery of chivalric theater, understanding that true power came not just from strength of arms, but from carefully cultivated reputation. His 1188 capture by French forces demonstrated this principle perfectly. When his ransom was set at the astronomical sum of £6,666, equivalent to millions today, England imposed a special Marshal tax to raise the funds, clear testament to his perceived value as both warrior and statesman. Marshal's career reached its zenith during the First Barons' War, when the 70-year-old knight was entrusted with protecting young Henry III after King John's sudden death. In this crisis, Marshal's political skills shone brightest. He negotiated peace with the rebel barons, reissued Magna Carta to restore order, and ruled as regent with remarkable restraint until the boy king came of age. His death at 72, peacefully in bed, surrounded by family, was itself extraordinary for a lifetime warrior. The glowing biography commissioned by Marshal's family established the template for the perfect knight: fierce yet compassionate, ambitious yet loyal. But this sanitized portrait obscured darker realities. Even Marshal, the so-called flower of chivalry, participated in brutal sieges where defenders were reduced to cannibalism and ordered mass executions during the Rochester Castle siege. His contemporary, Reynold of Chatillon, embodied knighthood's worst excesses, a sadistic warlord whose desecration of Islamic holy sites provoked Saladin's wrath and contributed to the Crusaders' disastrous defeat at Hattin in 1187. For every Marshal who balanced violence with statesmanship, there were dozens of lesser knights whose lives were nasty, brutish, and short. Consider the typical path of a 13th-century French knight. At 7, he'd be sent as a page to a lord's household, learning courtly manners between cuffed ears from impatient tutors. By 14, as a squire, he'd serve his knight like a glorified valet, cleaning armor, grooming war horses, and risking his life to retrieve his master from battlefields. His knighting ceremony at 21 would be followed by years of service in his lord's retinue, enforcing feudal will on resentful peasants between campaigns. The battlefield was a terrifying lottery. A well-aimed lance could unhorse him into the mud where he'd be trampled. Capture meant ransom or execution if he lacked wealthy backers. Even victory brought trauma: the screams of dying comrades, the stench of gangrenous wounds, the guilt of survival. Those who lived long enough might retire to manage a minor estate, forever marked by old injuries and nightmares. The medieval tournament evolved from its brutal 11th century origins into a dazzling spectacle of martial theater by the 13th century. What began as chaotic mock battles called melees transformed into carefully choreographed displays of knightly prowess, complete with colorful pageantry, elaborate rules, and adoring crowds. For knights like William Marshal, tournaments offered more than just glory. They were lucrative proving grounds where a skilled warrior could capture opponents for ransom, winning both reputation and fortune in a single afternoon. The joust emerged as the tournament's crown jewel, a breathtaking test of horsemanship and precision. Armored knights would charge at each other with leveled lances, the impact often sending splinters flying through the air like wooden shrapnel. A well-struck blow could unhorse an opponent in spectacular fashion, sending him crashing to the dirt in a cacophony of clanging metal. The victor would be crowned by a noble lady as the crowd roared its approval, though the defeated knight might nurse broken ribs or a concussion for weeks afterward. These events were far from the genteel sporting matches of modern imagination. The 1240 tournament at Neuss turned deadly when a melee descended into uncontrolled violence, leaving 80 knights slaughtered, a shocking toll for what was supposedly friendly competition. Protective measures like blunted weapons and specialized tournament armor reduced, but couldn't eliminate the dangers. Young Squire Wickman of Brunswick learned this tragically during his knighting ceremony in 1256, when a celebratory joust turned fatal. The tournament's dual nature reflected knighthood's essential contradiction. It was both a brutal combat training exercise and an elaborate performance of chivalric ideals. Knights like Jean Le Manger, better known as Boucicaut, mastered this duality. A veteran of crusades and countless battles, Boucicaut became a tournament superstar in the 14th century, his flamboyant entrances featuring musicians and poets singing his praises. His 1390 tournament at St. Tingelvert became legendary, drawing champions from across Europe for 30 days of jousting. Yet, even as tournaments grew more theatrical, the underlying violence remained. When English knight Sir Peter Courtenay was accused of cheating at St. Tingelvert by using an improperly weighted lance, he demanded trial by combat to defend his honor, a request only thwarted by royal intervention. Such incidents revealed how quickly chivalric decorum could give way to lethal confrontation when knightly pride was at stake. The risks were compounded by the staggering financial stakes. Knights invested fortunes in specialized tournament armor, lighter than battlefield gear, but often gilded for maximum visibility. Warhorses bred for these events could cost as much as castles. Many knights plunged into debt to fund their tournament careers, gambling that prize money and ransoms would cover their costs. The Burgundian knight Jacques de Lalling died at 33, leaving massive debts despite his tournament successes, a cautionary tale for aspiring champions. As the Middle Ages waned, tournaments became increasingly detached from actual warfare. The 1559 death of King Henry II, impaled through the eye by a lance splinter during a celebratory joust, symbolized the tradition's growing irrelevance in the age of gunpowder. What began as vital combat training had become a nostalgic performance, more concerned with heraldic display than martial utility. Yet the tournament's legacy endured in unexpected ways. Its emphasis on individual glory prefigured modern sports stardom, while the complex rules governing fair play laid groundwork for contemporary competition ethics. Most importantly, these violent pageants gave birth to enduring archetypes: the gallant champion, the noble adversary, the fair lady bestowing favors, that continue to shape our storytelling centuries later. The siege warfare of the Middle Ages represented a special kind of hellish ordeal that tested knights far beyond the open battlefield's terrors. When armies surrounded a castle or walled town, cutting off all supply lines, the resulting stalemate became a brutal war of attrition where starvation proved as deadly as any sword. For the besieging forces, the experience was a miserable exercise in patience and deprivation. Thousands of men camped in makeshift conditions outside the walls, their numbers gradually thinning from disease and desertion. Knights accustomed to fine wines and roasted meats now subsisted on hardtack biscuits and spoiled grain, their once proud physiques withering to gaunt shadows. The stench of unwashed bodies and overflowing latrines created a miasma that hung over the camp, while dysentery and typhus ran rampant through the ranks. But the defenders inside the walls suffered far worse. As food stores dwindled, desperate measures became commonplace. First, the livestock were slaughtered. War horses that had carried knights into battle now ended up in the cooking pots. Then dogs, cats, and rats disappeared from the streets. When even these ran out, people boiled leather armor for broth or scavenged for weeds and grass. Contemporary accounts from the siege of Chateau Gallard in 1204 describe defenders reduced to cannibalism, first eating the dead, then reportedly snatching infants from their mother's arms. The psychological toll was devastating. Knights trained for glorious combat now watched their comrades waste away, powerless to stop the creeping horror. At the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, chroniclers described how the stench of rotting corpses mingled with the acrid smoke of burning buildings, while flies swarmed over the living and dead alike. The once proud defenders became hollow-eyed skeletons clad in loose-hanging armor, their martial skills useless against the slow march of starvation. When a castle finally fell after months of siege, the aftermath often descended into unspeakable brutality. Victorious soldiers, their bloodlust heightened by long deprivation, would typically be unleashed on the conquered population in an orgy of violence known as the sack. The 1099 siege of Jerusalem saw Crusader knights, supposedly pious warriors of Christ, wading through streets running ankle-deep with the blood of slaughtered Muslims and Jews. One chronicler grimly noted how knights tormented survivors to reveal hidden treasures before killing them, creating piles of severed limbs in the city squares. Even the legendary Richard the Lionheart, often held up as a model of chivalry, ordered the massacre of 3,000 Muslim prisoners at Acre when negotiations stalled. This dark episode stood in stark contrast to his rival Saladin's more merciful treatment of Christian captives, a reminder that the chivalric ideal often crumbled when confronted with military expediency or religious hatred. The siege environment seemed to bring out the worst in even the most disciplined knights. At the 1204 siege of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, Western knights ostensibly fighting for Christendom instead sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. They defiled churches, raped nuns, and destroyed priceless ancient artworks in their greed for plunder. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates left heartbreaking accounts of aristocratic women throwing themselves from rooftops rather than face the Crusaders' brutality. These horrific scenes laid bare the hypocrisy at knighthood's core, the gap between the chivalric ideal of protecting the weak and the reality of warriors unleashed upon defenseless populations. While some knights like William Marshal maintained discipline even in victory, many others saw sieges as license for unchecked violence and enrichment. The Crusades distilled the knightly experience into its purest and most paradoxical form, where religious fervor and battlefield brutality became inextricably intertwined. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, calling knights to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, he unleashed a wave of martial pilgrimage that would redefine medieval warfare. For knights taking the cross, the journey itself was a harrowing trial. The overland route to the Holy Land stretched nearly 3,000 miles across treacherous terrain. Young French knight Reginald of Acre's experience was typical. His warhorse collapsed from exhaustion in Anatolia's scorching plains, forcing him to march on foot with armor chafing his bleeding feet. By the time his decimated force reached Antioch, Reginald was feverish and emaciated, dying anonymously like so many others before ever seeing Jerusalem. Those who survived the march faced even greater horrors at siege sites. At the 1098 Siege of Antioch, Crusaders reduced to eating leather and tree bark finally breached the walls after 7 months, only to become besieged themselves by a Muslim relief force. Chronicler Raymond of Aguilers described knights gnawing on Turkish corpses during the ensuing famine, their lips blackened from chewing saddle straps. When they finally triumphed through alleged discovery of the Holy Lance, the victorious Crusaders massacred every Muslim in the city, creating pyramids of severed heads. The 1099 Siege of Jerusalem exposed the full dichotomy of Crusader knighthood. After scaling the walls, blood-crazed knights butchered Muslims and Jews alike in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, so many that one chronicler wrote of riding through blood up to the horses' bridles. Yet these same men then walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping as they kissed the stone where Christ's body supposedly lay. This jarring juxtaposition of piety and savagery characterized the entire crusading movement. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 presented a mirror image. Where the Crusaders had slaughtered indiscriminately, the Muslim leader allowed Christian residents to leave peacefully upon payment of ransom. His chivalrous treatment of prisoners shamed many crusaders, though it didn't prevent Richard the Lionheart from executing 3,000 Muslim captives at Acre 4 years later when ransom negotiations stalled. The Crusades' legacy was profoundly ambiguous. They produced both monsters like Reynold of Chatillon, who had prisoners thrown from castle walls and threatened Mecca, and paragons like Louis IX of France, whose fairness earned respect even from Muslim adversaries. The military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers created disciplined warrior monks, yet their vast wealth and power eventually led to corruption and downfall. Most Crusader knights returned home profoundly changed, if they returned at all. Some became religious ascetics like the veteran who founded the Cistercian order, seeking atonement for Holy Land atrocities. Others, like the English knights who turned the Albigensian Crusade into a land grab in southern France, brought their battlefield brutality back to Europe. The psychological toll was immense. One chronicle describes a knight waking screaming from nightmares of Saracen blades years after returning. By the 1291 fall of Acre, the last Crusader stronghold, the dream of Christian knights nobly defending the Holy Land had long since curdled. The Templars' dramatic demise, accused of heresy and dissolved by a greedy French king, seemed a fitting epitaph for an era where spiritual ideals and earthly violence had become fatally entangled. The medieval knight's armor evolved into a masterpiece of metallurgical artistry, yet wearing it transformed the human body into a sweltering, barely mobile prison. By the 15th century, a full suit of plate armor comprised over 200 individually crafted pieces, weighing between 45 to 55 pounds, less than a modern soldier's pack, but distributed entirely across the body. The process of donning this carapace required two skilled squires working in precise sequence, taking up to an hour to secure every articulated joint and strap. Inside this metal shell, the knight existed in a world of sensory deprivation and constant discomfort. The helm's narrow vision slits reduced peripheral vision to near blindness, while breathing produced a metallic echo that drowned out battlefield commands. On summer campaigns, temperatures inside could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit 43 degrees Celsius, causing dehydration and heat stroke. The French knight Jean de Wavrin described the agony of wearing armor during the 1415 Agincourt campaign. The heat and stench became so unbearable that men fainted in their harness, their urine steaming where it ran down their leg plates. Yet this cumbersome protection was astonishingly effective. Tests at Britain's royal armories show well-fitted plate could deflect arrows fired from longbows at point-blank range. The curved surfaces were designed to glance off blows, while intricate articulation allowed surprising mobility. A trained knight could mount his horse unaided or perform cartwheels in full gear. The armor's true weakness wasn't its weight, but its vulnerability to concentrated attack. At Agincourt, dismounted French knights became mired in mud, where English men-at-arms used daggers to stab through gaps at the armpits and visor slits. The development of armor mirrored broader societal changes. Early chainmail hauberks gave way to transitional coat of plates in the 13th century, then to full plate by the 1400s, each innovation driven by deadlier weapons. The grotesque, pig-faced, bassinet helmets of the Hundred Years' War gave knights a demonic appearance, while later Renaissance armor featured etched designs so intricate they sacrificed protection for fashion. This arms race came at staggering cost. A full harness cost approximately 30 pounds in 15th century England, equivalent to a skilled craftsman's 8-year wages. Knights often mortgaged estates to outfit themselves, creating entire industries of armorers clustered around cities like Milan and Augsburg. The Burgundian Duke Charles the Bold once spent 1,200 pounds, nearly $500,000 today, on a single gilt armor set for ceremonial use, enough to equip 40 common soldiers. The psychological impact of armor was equally profound. Encased in steel, knights became both physically and psychologically separated from the common soldiers they commanded. French chronicler Jean Froissart observed how armored knights at Poitiers, 1356, moved through peasant infantry like ships through waves, oblivious to the men being trampled underfoot. This literal dehumanization perhaps explains some knights' capacity for brutality. When your opponent's face is hidden behind a visor, killing becomes abstract. By the 16th century, gunpowder rendered full plate obsolete, though the imagery of the armored knight endured. Henry VIII tonlet armor, weighing 94 pounds with its exaggerated peascod belly, was purely for tournament display, as impractical in battle as it was magnificent to behold. The last gasp of functional armor came in the form of bullet-tested proof, marks hammered into breastplates, but even these couldn't stop musket balls at close range. Today, these surviving suits in museums seem both awe-inspiring and faintly ridiculous, technological marvels that ultimately couldn't stop warfare's evolution. Yet for 3 centuries, they transformed men into near-invulnerable metal titans, creating the iconic image that still defines our vision of knighthood. The armor's greatest legacy may be how completely it obscured the vulnerable human within, allowing the myth of the invincible knight to outlast its practical reality. The medieval knight's warhorse was a carefully bred instrument of destruction, its training as meticulous as its riders. These massive destriers stood 16 to 17 hands high, 64 to 68 inches, at the shoulder, weighing up to 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone, dimensions that would dwarf modern racehorses. Bred for explosive power rather than endurance, they could deliver 12,000 pounds of force with a well-aimed kick, enough to crush a man's skull through his helmet. Training such animals required years of specialized conditioning. Starting at age 3, future warhorses underwent desensitization to battlefield chaos. Smiths hammered armor near them, while handlers waved banners and blew horns. They learned to bite, kick, and rear on command, becoming weapons in their own right. The Spanish riding school's modern lipizzaners still demonstrate the levade, maneuver medieval warhorses used to strike at infantry with their front hooves. The bond between knight and steed bordered on mystical. Chronicles describe warriors like William Marshal recognizing their mounts by touch in complete darkness, or horses refusing new riders after their masters died in battle. At the 1346 Battle of Crécy, the blind King John of Bohemia had his knights tie their horses to his, so he could charge one final time. All 6 steeds were found dead together the next morning, still linked to their slain king. This partnership came at enormous expense. A prime warhorse cost between 50 to 80 pounds in 14th century England, more than most knights' annual income. The 1298 Falkirk rolls record Edward I paying 193 pounds for a single charger, equivalent to a luxury car today, while lesser rounceys for squires went for 10 to 20 pounds. Maintaining these animals proved equally costly. A warhorse consumed 20 pounds of grain daily, plus hay and oats, requiring dedicated supply trains on campaign. The horse's armor presented another engineering challenge. A full bard comprised chamfron, head protection, crinnet, neck guard, and patral, chest plate, often decorated with heraldic designs. Test results at the Royal Armories show this steel shell could deflect arrows at 30 yards, though the 40 to 50 pound weight significantly reduced the horse's stamina. At Agincourt, many French knights dismounted their steeds before charging through the mud, a tactical error that contributed to their disastrous defeat. Veterinary care for these prized animals was surprisingly advanced. Medieval stable masters used antiseptic poultices of wine and garlic for wounds, while Arabian treatises detailed acupuncture techniques for lameness. The 12th century manual De Medicina Equorum by Jordanus Rufus included instructions for setting broken bones and treating colic, knowledge that crossed Christian-Muslim boundaries during the Crusades. Yet for all their value, warhorses remained vulnerable. At Bannockburn, 1314, English cavalry foundered in hidden pits dug by Scottish defenders. At Nicopolis, 1396, Ottoman archers specifically targeted French knights' mounts, knowing an unhorsed warrior in full plate was nearly helpless. The introduction of pike squares and longbow volleys in the 14th to 15th centuries made cavalry charges increasingly suicidal. By 1453, the Byzantine cataphract's final charge at Constantinople proved little more than a glorious but futile gesture against Ottoman gunpowder weapons. The warhorse's decline mirrored knighthood's eclipse. As firearms dominated battlefields, the massive destrier breed faded into obscurity, their descendants surviving only in ceremonial roles like royal guards or Renaissance fair reenactments. Yet their legacy endures in unexpected ways. The modern hand measurement, for inches, originates from the medieval practice of sizing horses by palm widths, while terms like charger and steed still color our language with echoes of chivalric romance. Perhaps most telling is how these animals transformed warfare psychology. A line of armored knights atop barred warhorses wasn't just a military formation. It was a seismic event, the medieval equivalent of tank battalions rolling forward. The ground shook under their advance, their collective breath steaming through chamfered openings like dragons from legend. For peasant infantry facing this onslaught, it must have seemed like the earth itself was charging against them, a terror we can scarcely imagine today, when the last echoes of hoofbeats have faded into history. The medieval knight's sword was far more than a weapon. It was a sacred object, a status symbol, and an extension of the warrior's very soul. Forged through days of painstaking labor, these blades represented the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy. Master smiths like England's Thomas de Colt and Germany's Johannes Ones combined soft iron cores with hardened steel edges through pattern welding, creating weapons both flexible and lethally sharp. The process was so revered that Norse sagas spoke of swords quenched in dragon's blood, while Christian knights had their blades blessed by priests in elaborate consecration rituals. The iconic longsword of the High Middle Ages typically measured 35 to 47 inches overall, with a tapered point for thrusting through armor gaps. Weight averaged just 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, lighter than most people imagine, allowing for astonishing dexterity. Fiore de Liberi's 1410 combat manual depicts knights performing disarms and grapples with these weapons, demonstrating techniques that would put modern fencing masters to shame. The murder stroke, holding the blade to use the crossguard as a hammer, showed their adaptability against plate armor. Sword mythology permeated medieval culture. The legendary Excalibur was said to glow with divine light, while Roland's Durendal supposedly contained St. Peter's tooth and other relics in its hilt. More historical blades developed their own reputations. The 13th century Sword of Mercy, curtana, used in English coronations, was believed to have been Tristan's weapon, its broken tip symbolizing knightly restraint. Yet these elegant weapons served brutal purposes. Forensic studies of bones from Bisbee, 1361, reveal the horrific damage swords could inflict: clavicles split cleanly, femurs severed with single strokes, skulls cleft down to the teeth. German fencing master Hans Talhofer's 1459 illustrations show techniques for eye gouging with pommels and groin strikes, a far cry from chivalric ideals. The sword's social significance outweighed even its martial function. A knight's weapon often passed through generations, with each nick in the blade telling a story. The 12th century Song of Roland describes dying knights tenderly trying to break their swords to prevent capture, while archaeological finds reveal others buried with their weapons and pagan-like traditions persisting into Christian times. Maintaining these weapons required constant attention. Rust could pit a blade overnight in damp conditions, prompting knights to carry oiled cloths for cleaning. Sharpening was an art itself. Surviving whetstones from castles show grooves from countless careful strokes. The finest swords bore smith's marks, like the Toledo or Passau wolf, medieval trademarks guaranteeing quality. As warfare evolved, swords adapted. The 14th century saw narrower estoc, thrusting swords for fighting in armor, while the Renaissance produced elaborate ceremonial rapiers. But by Elizabethan times, the knightly sword had become more jewelry than weapon, a glittering accessory to proclaim status rather than defend it. Modern reproductions fail to capture these weapons' true nature. When a skilled practitioner wields a properly balanced longsword today, the blade seems to move with a mind of its own, not the clumsy hacking of Hollywood, but a fluid dance of controlled violence. Perhaps this explains why these weapons still fascinate us centuries after they ruled the battlefield. In their perfect balance of beauty and lethality, they remain the purest expression of the knightly paradox. The medieval castle stood as both the knight's sanctuary and his prison, an architectural manifestation of feudal power that dominated the landscape. These stone behemoths were far more than military fortifications. They served as administrative centers, symbols of dominance, and crucibles of knightly culture. The 11th century Motte and Bailey designs with their wooden palisades gave way to imposing stone keeps like the White Tower of London, whose 15-foot thick walls whispered of invincibility. Life within the castle walls followed strict hierarchies that mirrored the knightly code itself. The Great Hall served as stage for both lavish feasts and solemn justice, where a lord might pardon a prisoner one moment and order an execution the next. The private chambers, often shockingly small by modern standards, witnessed intimate councils where wars were planned and marriages negotiated. Even the spiral staircases were designed with tactical purpose, their clockwise ascent giving right-handed defenders the advantage when striking downward. The castle's military evolution reflected an endless arms race between attackers and defenders. After witnessing the effectiveness of concentric castles in the Crusades, builders like Edward I incorporated multiple defensive rings at sites, like Caernarvon. The introduction of machicolations, stone galleries with murder holes, allowed defenders to rain death on besiegers while remaining protected. At Chateau Gallard, Richard the Lionheart's innovative shield-shaped towers eliminated blind spots, though even this masterpiece fell to starvation tactics after a 6-month siege. For all their martial purpose, castles also nurtured the softer arts of chivalry. Tapestries like the Hunt of the Unicorn adorned damp walls, their vibrant scenes contrasting with the stone's grim austerity. Minstrels circulated through smoky halls singing of Arthur and Roland, while ladies presided over courts of love that refined, at least in theory, the knight's rougher edges. The 14th century Livre de Chasse by Gaston Phoebus shows how hunting within castle grounds served as both training and ritualized violence. The castle's decline came not from improved siege engines, but from social change. As gunpowder rendered high walls obsolete, knights transformed their fortresses into Renaissance palaces. The moat became an ornamental garden. The arrow slits widened into picture windows. What had once been instruments of control now stood as romantic ruins, their crumbling battlements inspiring Gothic literature rather than feudal obedience. Yet, even in decay, these structures retain their power to evoke the knightly world. Walking through Conway Castle's intact passages, one can almost hear the clank of armor and whispered conspiracies. The graffiti left by long-dead guards still marks the walls, while chapel frescoes of armored saints watch over empty halls. More than any artifact, these stone labyrinths make tangible the paradox of knighthood, its blend of brutality and refinement, its simultaneous pursuit of God and gold, its uneasy balance between inspiring awe and enforcing terror. The knight's religious devotion formed the spiritual backbone of chivalry, yet often existed in uneasy tension with battlefield realities. From the moment of his vigil before knighting, when he would spend a night in prayer with his sword upon the altar, the medieval warrior was enmeshed in a complex web of sacred obligations. The Church's attempt to sanctify violence birthed institutions like the military orders, hybrid monk warriors whose Templar and Hospitaller knights swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while remaining Europe's most formidable fighting force. These warrior monks embodied Christianity's paradoxical relationship with knighthood. Their white mantles with red crosses symbolized purity and martyrdom, yet their battle tactics were ruthlessly efficient. At the 1187 Battle of Hattin, Templar knights reportedly fought so ferociously against Saladin's forces that their swords became too blunted to wield. The Teutonic Order's 14th century campaigns in Prussia baptized conquered lands in blood, forcibly converting pagans while establishing a theocratic state. Personal piety took equally dramatic forms. French knight Jean de Joinville's memoirs describe King Louis IX washing the feet of paupers barefoot in the snow, then leading crusades where prisoners were massacred. The ubiquitous pilgrimages knights undertook to Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem served as both penance and status display. Many donated looted wealth to monasteries, creating a spiritual insurance policy through chantry chapels where priests would pray for their souls in perpetuity. Religious artifacts accompanied knights into battle. The Sancta Camisa, believed to be the Virgin Mary's tunic, was carried before French forces at Bouvines, 1214. English knights at Agincourt swore oaths on a fragment of the true cross. Such sacred objects weren't mere symbols. Chronicles describe them being brought to the front lines, their divine power expected to tip the scales of combat. When the Holy Lance was discovered during the desperate siege of Antioch, 1098, it triggered a wave of euphoria that broke the siege. Yet this fervent faith coexisted with shocking brutality. The same knights who donated generously to abbeys might burn churches containing enemies. During the Albigensian Crusade, when asked how to distinguish heretics from true believers, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The 1099 Jerusalem massacre saw crusaders bloodying their hands in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, then walking barefoot to the Holy Sepulchre in tearful devotion. The Reformation shattered this centuries-old fusion of piety and violence. Protestant reformers rejected the cult of relics and saints, while Catholic councils like Trent, 1545-63, sought to purge military orders of corruption. By the time Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, 1605, the praying knight-errant had become a figure of gentle mockery, his lofty spiritual ideals out of step with an age of gunpowder and nation-states. Today, scattered traces of this martial Christianity endure. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta maintains a shadow of the Hospitaller's legacy, while Templar revival groups romanticize a more sanitized version of the past. In Westminster Abbey, the battered effigy of Henry V still grasps a sword with hands that once wielded steel at Agincourt. A frozen moment where earthly power and heavenly aspiration met in the figure of the kneeling warrior. The knight's relationship with women formed one of chivalry's most enduring paradoxes, a system that simultaneously idealized and objectified femininity. Courtly love traditions demanded knights worship noble ladies from afar, composing elaborate poetry and undertaking dangerous quests to prove their devotion. Yet these same warriors routinely participated in the rape of peasant women during military campaigns, their actions often excused as the spoils of war. The troubadour culture of 12th century Provence codified this contradiction. Poets like Bernard de Ventadorn sang of unattainable love, while noble women like Eleanor of Aquitaine presided over courts of love that allegedly judged romantic cases. The legendary judgments attributed to these courts, that true love couldn't exist between spouses, or that a peasant couldn't experience courtly passion, reveal the aristocratic exclusivity underlying these ideals. Marriage among the knightly class was rarely about love. Noble girls as young as 12 became political pawns in dynastic games, their weddings sealing alliances between powerful families. The 1152 annulment of Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Louis VII of France, followed immediately by her union with Henry II of England, transferred control of southwestern France and triggered centuries of conflict. For knights, extramarital affairs became almost expected, provided they followed courtly rituals. The reality of women's lives contrasted sharply with romantic ideals. Castle account books show noble women directing complex households, supervising preserves, managing servants, and overseeing defenses during sieges. The remarkable 15th century memoir of Marjorie Kemp reveals how some women appropriated chivalric language for spiritual quests, casting Christ as their heavenly knight. Meanwhile, peasant women faced constant threat from roving bands of soldiers, with legal records showing rape convictions against knights were virtually non-existent. A handful of women transcended these constraints. Joan of Arc's brief but meteoric career, leading French armies while wearing armor tailored for her body, proved the exception that underscored the rule. More typical was Christine de Pizan, the 14th century writer who cautiously advocated for women's education while praising traditional feminine virtues. Her Book of the City of Ladies constructed an allegorical metropolis populated by history's great women, a subtle rebuke to the misogyny prevalent in knightly circles. The Renaissance gradually transformed these relationships. As knights became courtiers rather than warriors, their treatment of women shifted toward elaborate Petrarchan conceits. The 16th century court of Marguerite de Navarre saw knights debating Neoplatonic love theories while composing meticulously crafted sonnets. Yet beneath this polished surface, violence persisted. The same men who wrote delicate verses might duel over insults to a lady's honor or force themselves on servant girls. Today's romanticized view of chivalric love owes more to Victorian reinterpretations than medieval reality. The Pre-Raphaelites painted languid ladies and pining knights, while Tennyson's Idylls of the King sanitized Arthurian legends for bourgeois audiences. Modern reenactors often perpetuate this myth, their polished performances erasing the exploitation that undergirded the original system. Yet traces of authentic medieval attitudes survive. In Siena's Palazzo Pubblico, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's 14th century frescoes show armored knights kneeling before allegorical female figures, not as lovers, but as servants to the abstract virtues of justice and peace. Perhaps this image comes closest to capturing the knightly ideal at its most noble, not the predatory seducer of romance, but the flawed warrior striving towards something greater than himself. The knight's legacy endures as a fractured mirror reflecting our deepest aspirations and darkest impulses. From the mud-soaked fields of Agincourt to the glittering halls of Camelot in popular imagination, this warrior caste has been endlessly reinterpreted to suit changing cultural needs. Modern historians estimate that between the 11th to 15th centuries, perhaps only 1% of medieval Europe's population ever attained knighthood, yet their cultural footprint dwarfs their actual numbers. Contemporary military traditions still bear the knight's imprint. The British Army's household cavalry maintains elaborate armor for ceremonial duties, while the French Foreign Legion's code of honor echoes chivalric oaths. Even modern military ethics debates about just war and prisoner treatment trace back to the inconsistent application of chivalric ideals on medieval battlefields. The Geneva Conventions might be seen as a distant descendant of the Truce of God movement that attempted to limit feudal warfare. In popular culture, the knight has become infinitely malleable. Game of Thrones deconstructed chivalric myths through characters like the morally conflicted Brienne of Tarth, while Monty Python's Holy Grail parody exposed the absurdities underlying knightly pretensions. Video games like Dark Souls transform armored warriors into pixelated avatars of existential struggle, proving the archetype's adaptability to new storytelling mediums. Academic scholarship continues reassessing knighthood's complexities. Recent archaeological work at Visby and Toten has used forensic analysis of mass graves to reconstruct the gruesome realities of medieval combat, challenging romanticized notions. Gender studies scholars highlight how Joan of Arc's cross-dressing threatened strict feudal hierarchies, while post-colonial theorists examine how Crusader rhetoric influenced later imperial ideologies. The knight's most enduring contribution may be the very concept of the warrior as moral agent. However imperfectly realized, the chivalric ideal suggested that violence could be tempered by ethical codes, a notion that still underpins modern military professionalism. When a 21st century soldier receives the Medal of Honor, the ceremonial language unconsciously echoes medieval dubbing rituals. As climate change and political instability reshape our world, we may be entering a new feudal age that makes the knight's story newly relevant. Private military companies resemble nothing so much as mercenary free companies of the Hundred Years' War, while billionaires building apocalypse bunkers recreate the castle mentality in modern form. The knight's journey from warlord to statesman offers cautious hope that raw power can evolve towards civic responsibility. Standing before the tomb effigy of William Marshal in London's Temple Church, his stone face still resolute after 8 centuries, one senses the weight of this legacy. The Marshal's life encompassed both the massacre at Limoges and the Magna Carta signing, reminding us that historical figures contain multitudes. Perhaps the knight's ultimate lesson is that all warrior cultures, no matter how brutal their origins, carry within them the seeds of their own transcendence.